Have you ever looked into someone's eyes and wondered how such a charming smile could hide such a cruel heart? That was Emma's life. To the world, Daniel looked like the perfect man. Handsome, confident, successful. But behind closed doors, he was a storm that never stopped. He knew how to twist words until Emma doubted herself. He knew how to make her feel small, worthless, invisible. He didn't need fists to hurt her. His weapon was control, and Emma lived in that invisible prison for years, slowly losing the pieces of herself she once loved. But something inside her refused to die. Every cruel word, every broken promise, every night she sat waiting for him to come home gave birth to a quiet fire. The kind of fire that doesn't burn hot but burns steadily. And one night, after discovering the lipstick on his collar and the lies on his phone, Emma knew she had only two choices: break or fight back. She chose to fight. At first, Daniel didn't notice. He thought she was still the same woman, silent, obedient, afraid. He never realized she was watching him, studying him, memorizing every careless boast about shady deals, every email he left open, every phone call that revealed too much. He never noticed her fingers flying across her laptop late at night while he slept, creating a story that looked real enough to ruin him. A fake company with a name that sounded legitimate. Bank accounts that led to nowhere. Documents with forged signatures and numbers that told the story of fraud, of laundering, of betrayal. She didn't rush. She waited. She baited him into replying to emails she wrote under false names, messages that praised him for handling transfers and closing deals. His ego was so large that he never questioned the flattery, and every word he typed became another nail in his coffin. She stitched them together with fake invoices, spreadsheets, and conversations until the puzzle looked perfect. Anyone looking in would believe Daniel was knee-deep in a crime he had never even committed. And then, when everything was ready, she let the world in. A tip to a journalist who loved chasing scandals. An anonymous call to a business partner. A document left just carelessly enough for someone to find. The trap was invisible, but it was tight, and slowly Daniel began to feel it close around him. At first, he laughed it off. He told his friends it was nonsense. He told Emma it was nothing, that people were jealous of his success. But then came the questions. Then came the subpoenas. Then came the calls he couldn't explain. Piece by piece, his confidence cracked. He paced their apartment, shouting at invisible enemies, accusing Emma of betrayal, but she just sat in silence, watching him unravel. The man who once whispered that no one would ever believe her was now shouting in desperation, insisting that no one should believe what the world was saying about him, and that was the sweetest irony of all. He had destroyed her reputation in private, and now his own reputation was being shredded in public. Emma didn't need to shout. She didn't need to gloat. She only needed to let the plan run its course. She had set the stage, and Daniel was playing his role exactly as she had imagined. Arrogant, careless, predictable. The world was watching now, not her. The evidence spoke louder than any words she could ever say. And as Daniel sat in front of investigators, struggling to explain the documents, the emails, the recordings, Emma felt a strange calm wash over her. For the first time in years, she wasn't the victim. She wasn't the girl in the shadows. She was the author of the story, and Daniel was finally trapped inside it. Revenge hadn't come with fire or fury. It had come with silence, patience, and precision. And in the end, it wasn't just Daniel's name that was destroyed. It was the illusion of power he had held over her. Emma walked away lighter, not because the past was erased, but because justice had finally shifted. Sometimes she thought, forgiveness isn't what sets you free. Sometimes it's making sure the person who hurt you faces a truth they can never escape. Daniel used to believe no one would ever believe her. Now no one believed him, and that was her victory. Daniel's downfall didn't come all at once. It came slowly, painfully, like a rope tightening around his neck with every passing day. At first, he treated it like a bad rumor. He told his friends, "It's nothing, just jealous people trying to drag me down." He told Emma, with that familiar smirk, that he had connections who could make all of this disappear. But the world was no longer listening to Daniel's charm. His calls went unanswered. Meetings were canceled. Friends who once laughed at his jokes now avoided his gaze. Emma watched from the sidelines as the man who once made her feel powerless became powerless himself. She remembered every night she had cried alone, waiting for him to come home. Every insult that had cut her deeper than a blade. Every time he had told her she was nothing. And now she saw it turned back on him. His voice grew louder, but his influence grew weaker. The louder he shouted, the less anyone believed him. He began drinking more, stumbling into the apartment late, smelling of alcohol and desperation. His confident swagger was gone. His phone, once buzzing with messages, now sat silent. He scrolled through it endlessly, searching for someone, anyone, who would stand by him. But no one did, and Emma? She played her part. She acted confused. She asked small, innocent questions. "What's happening, Daniel? Why are people saying these things about you?" She let her voice tremble, just enough to look believable. And every time he accused her, every time he shouted, she just shook her head and whispered, "I don't understand." Because she understood perfectly. The journalist who had received Emma's anonymous tip was relentless. She uncovered the shell company, connected the bank records, and pulled phone logs that seemed to tie everything back to Daniel. The story began to grow, picked up by larger outlets, whispered about in business circles. Daniel's name became a headline, not for success, but for scandal. He tried to fight back. He hired lawyers, sent out press releases, and even tried to threaten the journalist. But every step he took made him look guiltier. The evidence was too clean, too convincing, too damning. Exactly as Emma had planned. Then came the night Emma would never forget. Daniel stormed into the apartment, face red, eyes bloodshot, hands shaking. He threw papers across the table, copies of the investigation, subpoenas, letters from lawyers. "This is your fault," he screamed. "You did this to me." Emma sat still, calm, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at him with steady eyes, the way he had once looked at her when she was broken. And she said nothing. Her silence was the sharpest knife. Daniel paced the room, pulling at his hair, muttering to himself. For the first time, Emma saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. The kind of fear he had once planted in her. And she realized something. She didn't need to scream. She didn't need to fight. She had already won. The next weeks were chaos. Investigators came in and out, collecting files, seizing computers. Emma gave her statements carefully, softly, always as though she were just a bystander. "I don't know anything about his work," she told them, her voice low. "He never shared details with me." And they believed her. Why wouldn't they? She looked fragile, quiet, harmless. Daniel, on the other hand, looked like a liar. His stories changed with every retelling. His anger spilled over in interviews. He contradicted himself and blamed people who weren't even involved. And the world turned its back. The man who once controlled Emma's every move could no longer control his own story. Emma watched as he lost everything. The business partners cut him off. The bank accounts froze. His friends drifted away. Even his family, tired of the shame, kept their distance. Daniel had built his life on power, but power is fragile when built on lies, and now it crumbled around him. But here's the strange part. When the dust began to settle, Emma didn't feel the joy she thought she would. She didn't feel triumphant or wild with satisfaction. What she felt was peace. Quiet, steady peace. She remembered the girl she had been. The girl who thought no one would ever believe her. The girl who lived in fear, walking on eggshells, too afraid to raise her voice. That girl was gone, and in her place was a woman who had taken control of her own story. Revenge hadn't erased the past. It hadn't taken away the nights of pain or the years of silence. But it had given Emma something else. It had given her freedom. Daniel would spend years trying to clear his name, years trying to rebuild the empire he had lost. But it wouldn't matter, because the stain of scandal never truly washes out. People would always remember him as the man who was exposed, the man who played dirty and lost. And Emma? She walked away. She started fresh. New city, new job, new life. She carried scars, yes, but she carried them with pride. They were not signs of weakness. They were proof of survival, proof of strength. And every time she thought back to Daniel, every time his face flickered in her memory, she reminded herself of the night she took her power back, the night she stopped being the victim, the night she became the author of her own story. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from forgiveness. Sometimes it comes from creating a truth so undeniable that even the people who once doubted you are forced to believe. Emma had been broken. But in the end, she had built something stronger from the pieces. And Daniel, he was left with nothing but the ruins of his own arrogance. That was her victory. And it was more powerful than any apology he could have ever given. Daniel's world shrank day by day. The man who once filled every room with his presence now barely left the apartment. The curtain stayed closed, the phone unanswered. The once immaculate suits left crumpled in piles. He moved like a ghost, haunted by the whispers that followed him everywhere. Emma observed quietly. She no longer felt the need to interfere. His destruction had gained momentum, and momentum no longer needed her hand to push it forward. All she had to do was watch, but watching wasn't always easy. There were moments, fleeting, fragile moments, when she almost pitied him. When she saw him staring at old photographs, his eyes hollow, his lips trembling as if he were searching for the man he used to be. When he muttered apologies to no one in particular, words too soft for her to fully catch. Almost, because then she would remember. She would remember the nights she had begged for kindness and received only cruelty. She would remember the times he twisted her words, turned her fears against her, and made her feel like she was losing her mind. And pity would vanish, replaced by the quiet certainty that this was the balance he had earned. The city outside carried on without him. New names replaced his in the newspapers. New faces took over the circles he once dominated. He was no longer the star, he was a warning. A lesson people whispered about over coffee, shaking their heads at how quickly a man could fall. Emma began to rebuild her own life, piece by piece. At first, it was simple things. She started taking long walks in the evening, breathing in air that didn't feel heavy with tension. She read books she had once loved but abandoned when life with Daniel consumed her. She bought a small plant, something green and alive, something that reminded her she could nurture again. She even laughed, truly laughed, with a colleague at her new job one afternoon. And when the sound escaped her lips, it startled her. It had been so long since laughter felt natural, so long since it wasn't followed by guilt or punishment. But Daniel noticed. He always noticed. One evening when she returned from work, he looked at her with eyes filled with suspicion. "You're happier," he said flatly, as if happiness itself was a betrayal. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The distance between them grew wider with each passing day. Once he had been the center of her world. Now he was just the shadow in the corner of the room, a reminder of what she had overcome. Then came the trial. The evidence, carefully planted and meticulously presented, painted him as a man with no morals, no loyalty, no conscience. He fought hard, but his words rang hollow. Too many lies, too many inconsistencies. The court of public opinion had already judged him guilty long before the legal one did. Emma sat in the back of the courtroom, quiet, almost invisible. She didn't need to testify. She didn't need to speak. The story spoke for itself. Daniel glanced at her once, his eyes desperate, searching for some sign of loyalty, some sign that she was still on his side. But she gave him nothing, just silence. And in that silence, he finally seemed to understand. After the verdict, his world collapsed completely. His accounts were drained, his reputation destroyed, his future bleak. The empire he had built on manipulation and control was gone. What remained was only the man himself, fragile, broken, and utterly alone. Emma left soon after. She packed her things in quiet hours, folding her clothes neatly, slipping her books into a suitcase, carefully placing the little plant she had bought into the passenger seat of her car. She didn't leave a note. She didn't say goodbye, because she didn't need to. Her life was no longer tied to his downfall. She had carried her revenge to completion, but what mattered most wasn't the ruin she left behind. It was the freedom she carried forward. In her new city, no one knew her as Daniel's partner. No one saw her as the silent woman standing behind a powerful man. She was just Emma, and for the first time in years, that was enough. But revenge has a strange aftertaste. It's not sweet, not bitter, something in between. There were nights she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had gone too far, wondering if the line between justice and vengeance had blurred. And yet, every time she doubted, every time the thought of guilt crept in, she reminded herself of one thing. She had survived him. And survival sometimes demands more than endurance. It demands reclaiming what was stolen. Daniel's name would forever be remembered with scandal. Emma would not. She had erased herself from his story, while ensuring he could never erase himself from hers. Years later, if someone mentioned his name in passing, she would smile faintly and say, "I knew him once." Nothing more. Because to her, Daniel was no longer the villain of her life. He was just a chapter, one she had closed. Her story, her voice, her power, it was hers again. And that was the greatest revenge of all. Time has a way of softening wounds, but it also has a way of deepening scars. For Emma, the years after leaving Daniel were both liberating and strange. Freedom felt like sunlight after a long winter, but it also left her blinking, adjusting, unsure of what to do with all the space around her. At first, she filled it with simple pleasures. Morning walks with coffee in hand, exploring small bookstores tucked away on quiet streets, learning how to cook recipes she had always been too afraid to try because Daniel would sneer at her efforts. She decorated her small apartment with mismatched furniture, not because it was perfect, but because it was hers. The silence, once oppressive, now felt gentle. She no longer waited for footsteps in the hallway, no longer braced for the sound of keys rattling angrily at the door. She could breathe. She could laugh. She could live. But the past has a way of echoing. Sometimes she would catch herself flinching when someone raised their voice. Sometimes she woke up in the middle of the night, heart racing, certain she had heard Daniel calling her name. Trauma lingers, even when the source is gone, and Emma knew that. She began therapy. At first it felt uncomfortable, like peeling away layers she had worked hard to hide, but slowly she found her voice. She told her story, not just about Daniel, but about herself, about the dreams she had buried, the fears she had carried, the fire she had found. She cried. She laughed. She healed. Meanwhile, Daniel's world shrank to almost nothing. The headlines faded, the gossip died down, but the damage remained. No company wanted to hire him. No friend wanted to be associated with him, and no investor wanted to take the risk. He lived alone in a small apartment far from the glittering city where he once reigned. The suits that once fit perfectly hung loose on his thinning frame. The charm that once dazzled now seemed desperate. He spent hours pacing, reliving the glory days, rehearsing speeches no one would ever hear. He tried to convince himself it was all a misunderstanding, that he had been framed. And though part of him suspected Emma, he could never prove it. He had underestimated her too deeply, for too long. Sometimes he wrote letters, long, rambling letters filled with accusations, pleas, and apologies all tangled together. He never sent them. He had no address for her. She had vanished from his life as completely as he had once tried to vanish her from hers. Years passed. Emma built a new life, steady and quiet. She took up painting, filling canvases with colors that reflected the emotions she once buried. She traveled, even if just to nearby towns, savoring the feeling of being free to move without permission. She made friends, real friends, who knew her not as someone's partner, but as Emma, kind, witty, resilient Emma. And yet, one winter evening, fate decided their paths would cross again. Emma was leaving a cafe, bundled in a scarf, when she saw him. Daniel. Older, thinner, his once sharp eyes dulled, his posture slumped. He was standing by the corner, holding a worn briefcase, his hands trembling slightly in the cold. For a moment, time stopped. She almost didn't recognize him. This wasn't the man who had towered over her life like a storm. This was a shadow. Their eyes met. He froze. She froze. The world around them blurred, as if the city itself held its breath. "Emma," he whispered, voice cracked and hoarse. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. He stepped closer, his expression a mixture of shame and desperation. I need you to believe me. I didn't do it. I didn't..." His words faltered, lost in the icy air. For years, Emma had dreamed of this moment. She had imagined what she would say if she ever saw him again. She had rehearsed speeches filled with rage, with triumph, with bitterness. But standing there, looking at the broken man before her, she felt none of those things. She felt only clarity. She smiled faintly, not with cruelty, but with certainty. "I know," she said softly. His eyes widened, confusion flickering across his face. But before he could respond, she turned and walked away, her footsteps steady, her heart calm, because the truth didn't matter anymore. Not to her. She had already won, not by destroying him, but by reclaiming herself. Daniel could live the rest of his life chasing explanations, drowning in regret, searching for the pieces of his shattered image. But Emma was free. In the quiet of her apartment that night, she painted again. Bright colors, bold strokes, a canvas filled with light. She thought of the girl she used to be, the woman she had become, and the road she had traveled between the two. Revenge had given her justice, but healing had given her peace. And peace, she realized, was the sweetest victory of all. Daniel faded from her story, as all villains eventually do, and Emma lived, not in his shadow, but in her own light. Seasons turned, and with them, Emma's life unfolded in ways she never imagined during the long, dark years with Daniel. She grew older, but instead of fading, she bloomed. Each year carried her further from the shadows of her past, and closer to the life she had always deserved. She began volunteering at a local shelter, a place where women came with their stories, their bruises, their broken trust. At first, she only listened, sitting in the corner during group meetings, hearing voices tremble with the weight of pain she knew too well. But slowly she found herself speaking. Her words weren't rehearsed. They came from scars, from memories, from survival. And when the women looked at her with wide eyes, recognizing their own struggles in her story, Emma realized something powerful. Her past could be someone else's map to freedom. One night, after sharing her story with a trembling young woman named Claire, Emma walked home with tears in her eyes. Not from sadness, but from a strange, fierce pride. Her pain had once defined her. Now it was shaping her into a source of strength for others. Daniel had taken so much, but he had given her one thing without knowing it: the ability to understand, to empathize, to guide. The more she gave, the lighter she felt. She led workshops, taught women how to recognize manipulation, how to rebuild their confidence, and how to see their worth. She didn't speak of revenge, she spoke of resilience. Her story was not about destruction anymore. It was about rising, about living beyond the ruins. And life, as it often does, surprised her. At one of those workshops, she met Michael. He wasn't like Daniel. He wasn't loud or flashy or commanding. He was steady, gentle, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. Their connection wasn't instant fire. It was slow, careful, like a candle gradually warming a cold room. For a long time, Emma resisted. The walls around her heart were high, built from years of betrayal. But Michael was patient. He never tried to climb the walls. He simply stood on the other side, waiting, showing her that love didn't have to come with chains. When she finally let him in, it wasn't with a rush. It was with a sigh of relief. She discovered that love, real love, wasn't about control. It was about freedom. It was about laughter over burnt dinners, long walks under quiet skies, and holding hands without fear. Emma knew she could live without love. She had proven that. But having it again, this time in its purest form, felt like reclaiming something Daniel had stolen, the belief that she was worthy of kindness. Meanwhile, Daniel's years stretched thin. Age weighed heavily on him, not just on his body but on his spirit. He had no empire to return to, no friends to lean on, no family to soften his fall. His phone rarely rang, and when it did, it was only debt collectors or wrong numbers. His days blurred into each other, filled with bitterness and endless reruns of a life he could no longer touch. Sometimes, late at night, he sat at his desk, staring at the faded photographs of himself in tailored suits, shaking hands with men who no longer remembered his name. He poured himself cheap whiskey and whispered to the empty room, "I was someone once." But no one was there to answer. The regret gnawed at him. Not just the scandal that had ended his career, but the way he had treated Emma. He replayed moments in his head, her quiet pleas, her downcast eyes, the times she had asked for affection and he had turned away. He wondered if she had been the one who destroyed him. Deep down he knew. But even deeper, he knew he had given her every reason to do it. One winter, his health began to fail. The years of stress, of loneliness, of bitterness caught up with him. He grew weaker, slower, more fragile, and in those final days, lying in a hospital bed with no visitors, he whispered her name, Emma, as if saying it might summon her, as if the universe might grant him one last chance to apologize. But the room remained empty, the silence unbroken. Emma never knew. By then, she was living far away, her days filled with love, her evenings filled with laughter, her heart finally at peace. She did not need to look back. And yet sometimes, when the world was quiet and she stood on her balcony watching the stars, she thought of him. Not with anger, not even with pity, just with a strange kind of detachment. He had been the storm, yes, but storms pass. What remains afterward is life, growth, renewal. And Emma had chosen to grow. Her story was no longer about Daniel. It was about Emma, about the girl who had once been silenced, the woman who had once been broken, and the survivor who had risen not just to take revenge, but to reclaim joy, freedom, and love. Years later, when she held her first grandchild in her arms, Emma smiled through tears. She looked at the tiny face, so full of possibility, and thought of everything she had endured. She knew that child would grow up never knowing the pain she had known, never seeing her as a victim, but as the strong, loving woman she had become. She had turned her suffering into wisdom, her revenge into freedom, her scars into stories of survival. And that, she realized, was the greatest victory anyone could ask for, because Daniel's name had been forgotten. But Emma's story would live on, in her family, in the women she had helped, in the quiet strength she carried every single day. Revenge had started her journey, but love, healing, and resilience had written her ending, and it was an ending she chose.